Now, let's get on with it and speak about whether or not there will be a peace deal in Ukraine. This is after essentially Trump has managed to get Zelensky on side, the promise of having boots on the ground, but in a commercial sense from America, with the 50-50 rare earth minerals split. America says is enough of a backstop, a security backstop. And Ukraine has essentially agreed to a small ceasefire, a pause, an immediate 30-day cessation in fighting. And so now that's been put back to Putin. Kelsa, please. Putin said, well, you know, I like the idea in principle of not fighting, but I have all of these conditions, and those conditions include international recognition of the territory he's already captured. So basically, keeping the spoils of his illegal invasion. Crippling limits on the size of Ukraine's army. So essentially making sure if he wants to go back for more, that Ukraine can't defend itself. A ban on NATO membership. Yep, Ukraine can't defend itself and nobody else can defend it. And according to Reuters, no foreign peacekeepers in the country. So basically nothing at all to deter him. Well, he does drive a hard bargain, doesn't he? It'll be interesting to see how Trump reacts to that. Let's get the thoughts now of Mark Francois, MP, because he is the Shadow Defence Minister. Mark, I think we've managed in the West now to come round to the conclusion that one thing that hasn't really been done until Trump came into the White House was talk about peace in Ukraine, talk about there being some sort of deal. Everyone seemed to rally against it and just kept saying more war, less jaw. But it seems at least Trump has sparked that conversation and he's managed to get Zelensky on side. Problem is, he's really going to struggle with Russia, isn't he? So what next?
Well, Zelensky offered a 30-day ceasefire after the talks in Jeddah. And so the ball was put into Putin's court. And it looks as if Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, met with Putin last night in Moscow. He's now traveling back to debrief the President of the United States. And in short, it looks as if President Putin's basically lobbed the ball back over the net into Trump's court because a Kremlin spokesman said a few hours ago they were cautiously optimistic about the possibility of a ceasefire, but there would be conditions. So these are classic Russian stalling tactics. And the risk here is that Putin is still advancing in eastern Ukraine. And if he thinks he's winning, he'll keep coming. And that's why it's very important that the whole of the West, including Britain, including our European allies, including the United States, is in no way naive about what Putin is up to and continues to stand up to it.
Do you think that this will now see a change in what seems to have explicitly been American policy so far, which is coming down like a ton of bricks on Ukraine and sort of leaving Putin out of it? Do you think we're now going to see a change in policy from the White House, or is that being rather too hopeful?
Well, President Trump said, I think, a couple of days ago that, you know, if Putin did not accept this ceasefire, then, you know, he was prepared to hurt the Russian economy. The implication was that he would increase the sanctions on Russia. And let's see whether or not President Trump will now follow that through. I mean, Lavrov, who's the foreign minister, I met Lavrov some years ago at the Russian embassy. He's a classic exponent of what you might call stalling tactics. And so Putin, it would appear, is paying lip service to the idea of a ceasefire because he doesn't want to enrage Trump. But he's come up with a whole range of conditions. So, of course, he wants a ceasefire, but not just yet. And the risk is he tries to string this out for as long as possible while still murdering Ukrainians. So it's very important, I believe, that the whole of the West, including President Trump, basically call his bluff.
How can we as a nation convince President Trump to do that? Because from what I've heard from an advisor to the Ukraine Foreign Ministry is we're only putting about 30% of possible sanctions on Russia at present. Why on earth have we not been putting more during the whole of the past 3 years?
The whole point about sanctions is in order for them to be effective, you have to do them collectively. So with our allies, we've stepped up the sanctions over a period of years. But, you know, if the President of the United States were now to give a very clear lead, if he were to say, OK, I think Putin is deliberately stalling here, I'm going to up the ante and put pressure on Russia rather than just on Ukraine, then it would be very interesting to see what Putin's reaction would be. He is the aggressor. He invaded Ukraine not once but twice. Once in 2014 and again in 2022. He's the man that's been using cruise missiles to blow up children's hospitals in Ukraine. We've got to be very clear-eyed about who we're dealing with here. He's an ex-KGB colonel. He's not a Boy Scout. So now would be the time, I hope, for European allies to stand strong with Ukraine and for the President of the United States to follow up with what he threatened and to say that if Putin stalls, then hopefully the United States would react robustly.
What do you think's been going on here, Mark? Because I think that, one thing we in Britain need to understand is the Ukrainian question has long been in contention in the Republican Party in America, because quite frankly, a lot of Americans go, where is Ukraine? Why are we sending all this money over to Ukraine? Then they also sort of go, oh yeah, that Hunter Biden thing, and they didn't have dodgy deals with Ukraine. So really on the Republican side of the argument, there has been very little sympathy for backing up Ukraine, particularly when Europe, frankly, wasn't doing enough. I think UK's been pretty decent, but certainly our colleagues and friends in countries such as Germany are very lily-livered about really cutting off Russia because, well, they've got their own political and economic reasons for that. But do you think that, as a result, if Europe is now making noises that it's going to increase defence spending, that it's going to, put its money where its mouth is, that Trump might be convinced to enter back into the battle? Because we did see that cessation of arms going to Ukraine for a while, and then that aid has started flowing back again.
Well, right, on Germany first, they just had a general election. They elected a conservative government, in effect, rather than a socialist one. So, and the new German Chancellor, Merz, is much more robust than all of this. So I think we're going to see quite a change in German policy on this. On America, I was part of a delegation a little over a year ago that went to Congress to lobby for the Republicans to pass the aid package. And we met a number of Republican congressmen. I remember one exchange. And he said to me very bluntly, this is similar to your question, right? Why should I ask the people of my district to send their taxpayer dollars to Ukraine? And I replied, because the Baltic states and Poland are members of NATO, and it's better to send your money than to send your sons and daughters. So, history shows appeasing dictators doesn't work. Putin's a dictator. Xi's a dictator. If he's seen to win in Ukraine, Taiwan will become more at risk because Xi will see that, if might is right and the West is weak, he's more likely to move against Taiwan. So there's a great deal at stake here. And I think Americans, including Republican congressmen, understand the history of some of this. And bluntly, if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine by helping the Ukrainians, we'll have to stop him in the Baltic states. And if we don't stop him in the Baltic states, we'll have to stop him in Poland. By then, you're into something that looks pretty akin to World War III. So better to stop him in Ukraine and back the Ukrainians to the hilt. Well,
do you support then Polish President Andrzej Duda, who's basically said a good deterrent might be if America decided to station its nukes in Poland?
Well, I remember reading an interview a few years ago, let me answer it like this, by the Ukrainian general who'd been in charge of the Ukrainian bit of what was the old Soviet strategic rocket forces. So he was the guy in charge of the nukes in Ukraine. And he gave this interview a couple of years ago, and he said, I pleaded back in 1994 with the then Ukrainian government not to give up our nuclear weapons. But instead, they signed an accord, the so-called Budapest Accords, which Russia signed, which we signed, and others. And that was meant to guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It was a solemn agreement. And then when it suited their purposes, whilst Ukraine had given up their nuclear weapons, they just marched in. So, you don't see many C&D badges in the House of Commons anymore. And all the more reason, by the way, for us to maintain our own strategic independent nuclear deterrent, so that the Ukrainians gave up theirs, and we saw what happened. So it's very important that the West improves, not just keeps up its defences, but rearms against what is a genuine Russian threat. I'm not scaremongering here. Putin's tank factories are working 3 shifts. The Russians are massively rearming, and we can't be blind to that, which is why I think we welcome the fact that the governments are increasing defence spending, and the other NATO allies look as if they're going to follow suit. There's a big NATO summit in The Hague towards the end of June, and it may be that at that summit the NATO nations collectively agree to increase defence spending, and that I think would be a very welcome thing.
Would you welcome as well what Sir Keir Starmer had proposed, which is British boots on the ground in some sort of demilitarised zone?
Well, we need to understand, I mean, we're very open-minded about that, but we need to understand what is the nature of the peace agreement, if there is one, that you're protecting. Once you understand that, then you can talk about what the military mission might be. And once you've agreed what the mission is, then you can start to talk about force packages and, you know, what sort of military units you might deploy, whether you'd have jets in the air. But the first thing you need is to get a ceasefire. So we need to understand, if there's going to be a ceasefire, is Russia just stringing us along, or are they serious? And if they are serious and there's a ceasefire and they stop murdering Ukrainians, that'll be a good thing. And then would that ceasefire then lead to a permanent agreement? And if it does, which I hope it would, what are the terms of that agreement? And once you know that, then you can start getting into force packages and stuff like that.
Is there not a risk here that the only way to get some sort of agreement is to build Putin the proverbial golden bridge? He has to walk away with something. So whatever happens, he's essentially going to be rewarded for his evil invasion.
Well, there was a British admiral in the First World War called Sir Jackie Fisher, and he was the first Sea Lord. He famously said, ultimately, all nations desire peace, but peace on their terms. And what we cannot allow is a settlement that would allow Putin to claim victory, including to his own people. Because if we did do that, he'll wait a few years and then he'll come again, almost certainly. So any agreement that's reached, the Ukrainians have to be part of those negotiations. Otherwise, it's completely impractical. And it has to be something that shows to the world that Putin didn't win. All the more reason for us to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainians. Because, forgive me for repeating it, but it bears repetition in this context. Appeasement doesn't work. Our whole history shows us that time and time again.
Marc-Francois, thank you ever so much. Shadow Defence Minister there. I think the problem we face, frankly, is that, you know, Putin's already holding a lot of cards, isn't he? He was able to continue his invasion unbridled. We've, without doing enough in the first instance, have backed ourselves into a corner with a war of attrition. And now Putin, people saying, oh, will you stop? And he's like, all right, give me what I want and then I will. And I don't quite know how we get around that unless someone like America is prepared to wade in and smash a load of hard sanctions on them. But we've heard a lot of people say today that they might not always understand what Putin's up to, but Trump, he could change his mind in a moment, couldn't he? He could be quite mercurial. Zelensky is going back over to the White House. Maybe he'll turn around and go, he's a great guy, I like this guy, and then, you know, turn his ire on Russia. I don't know.